Hello everyone! Victor Vran is out. This is something that I try to do for games that I've done a Hitchhiker's Guide to Early Access of in a timely manner soon after they've released. And this one was a bit unexpected for me because I knew that Victor Vran was nearing its release date when I did the video, but I didn't know how close it actually was. That's actually why I did it. I figured it still had a little ways to go, but as it turns out, they had some huge content updates and pushed the game right out. So it's out now. It actually has been pretty heavily patched the last week or so to kind of get the performance where it should be, to add a little bit of bug fixing and things like that, and they've done a really good job actually pushing it out and keeping it updated and well on its way. So yeah, Victor Vran is out. So usually in one of these, you know, it's out videos wouldn't come so quickly after the early access episode, but in this case I just kind of chose poorly, I guess, when to actually cover it. But yeah, so since that video was so recent, there's not a whole lot extra that I can really say or add, but I figured that I would try and go back and maybe kind of reiterate for people that never saw the other video and just kind of give my thoughts on the game itself. Victor Vran is an ARPG with some very interesting exceptions to a lot of the rules that the genre has. It actually uses WASD for movement instead of your mouse, like you would be used to in more, you know, standard ARPG style games. Think Diablo, think Torchlight, think Path of Exile, which I've been playing way too much of recently, so I'm probably going to use that as a comparison a couple of times. The game has a couple of other interesting features. You may be noticing the skill bar is odd looking. It's separated into two bits of 3 skills. That's because your weapons are actually what give you your skills. Now, in most ARPGs, you choose a class at the beginning of the game. That's just how they work. You choose a class, and that class has a particular set of items that they are best with, and a particular sort of skill set. You know, if you picked a Necromancer in Diablo 2, you had Necromancer skills. If you picked a Crusader in Diablo 3, you had Crusader skills. It's pretty basic stuff, but in this case, you don't actually pick a class ever, at all. You always play the same character, and that is, of course, Victor, who, by the way, is voiced by Geralt, yes, beautiful voice, and does a fantastic job, as you would expect, and basically you're always the same character, so that means your build has to come from what you actually equip. You'll notice in the equipment screen when it comes up that you don't actually have the standard kind of paper doll with all of the bits of armor, you know, helmet, chest, legs, gauntlets, 2 weapon sets usually, things like that. It's a bit different. You have an outfit, and that is it. That is your entire armor set, basically, is one outfit. And they're very rare. You don't get a lot of them, so choose wisely. And mostly what the outfits are actually for is a combination of armor, some health maybe, and the overdrive mechanic, which is that yellow bar in the bottom right. Overdrive fuels your demon powers, of which you can equip 2 of, and they are sort of your special skills, like you would actually think of when it comes to an ARPG getting skills, you know, your fireballs, your lightning, your raising zombies or whatever. In this case, you have demon powers, and they range from a very damaging and fast blink to calling down meteors, to calling down a purging pyre of flame, to shooting a ray of light, turning into a cloud of bats. There are lots of them, actually. Auras, even. There are auras that can convey a couple of different things. Basically, your build comes entirely from the weapons and powers and cards you have equipped. So you have 2 weapons that you can choose from at any given time, and you have 2 powers, 2 consumables, and then your divinity card slots, which is something I'll have to explain in a second. Your weapons, however, each have 3 skills, which is an interesting way to actually do it for this game. Most ARPGs, your weapons are basically stat sticks most of the time. They usually have an attack, as in an auto attack, but most of your skills and things involve actually using the stats of the weapon and not necessarily literally using the weapon itself. except for if you're using certain physical things with, you know, cleave attacks and whatnot that use your weapon, but they only use it as a kind of basis for stats and the type of weapon, i.e. like a one-handed sword or a two-handed staff and things like that. In Victor Vran, it's actually quite a lot different because every weapon type has 3 skills that only that weapon type has. So the weapons I'm using for most of the footage in the background are some legendaries that I found, actually. Got kind of lucky with some drops. I found a legendary, and then a couple minutes later I found a very silly vendor that was willing to sell me another legendary for literally all the gold I had up to that point, but hey, worth it. One of them is a hammer, and the hammer in this game is a very AoE-centric, slow, powerful weapon. Very high damage, but of course very slow swings with a lot of AoE. It also can give you this big crash down that's a larger AoE and gives you life leech for a limited time, and a chargeable big overhead swing that has the biggest area of all of the attacks, and is a really good choice to use after the life leech, so you get the maximum amount of life. And the other one is a shotgun. There are actual long-range weapons as well. It's often a good idea to have one melee and one long-range weapon, but it's not, you know, required. Not at all. The shotgun is actually called the Reanimator, and unfortunately it doesn't, like, raise skeletons when you shoot. I think it'd be awesome if it, like, shot skulls or something, and, like, one of the skills was replaced with something that allowed you to do something with, like, skeletons, because that's the kind of look of the shotgun. But anyway, the shotguns are as you would expect, a kind of crowd control long-range weapon with an aimed shot that can cripple and a big, wide, short-range kind of spray, a fan. And every weapon is along these lines, and you'll notice that every weapon's 3 skill set synergizes with itself in some way. Like I mentioned with the hammer giving you life leech, and then having that big damaging attack, the obvious synergy there is to use the life leech attack first to give yourself the healing, and then hit as hard as you can with a big crit or just the big AoE attack to get as much health back as possible, because it doesn't last for too long. Every weapon has a synergy like that. The lightning gun is a really interesting one. For instance, it fires a beam of lightning that chains between people, and it can launch a ball of lightning that will then bounce between targets that have recently been electrocuted by the lightning. So basically, it's just a big crowd control lightning rave. It's kind of great, and it also has the sort of big AoE electrocution mine sort of thing. There's also things like the sword, of course, the rapier, which is actually separate from the sword, and that it's much more quick, single target focused, and very heavily focused on defeating armor. It's got a lot of armor piercing innate to it. The scythe is one of my favorites. It's actually got its own resource system. You build up soul shards as you attack things with the scythe, and you can spend the soul shards, that's hard to say, on its secondary attacks, which involve a big AoE daze, so that you can, you know, harvest the whole field of standing there enemies, and a big whirlwind attack that lasts longer depending on how many shards you've built up. Basically, every weapon is a lot different, and if you're very clever, you can even find ways to make the 3 skill sets synergize not only with each other, or well, with themselves, but with each other, and very quickly switch between the weapons and use their skills, because there is barely a time between switching. It doesn't take long at all, so you can do some fun things. You may be noticing I'm not doing too badly, although I screw up a couple times. Legendaries are nice. The legendary hammer, by the way, is a giant pumpkin that leaves big jack-o'-lantern faces on the ground when you slam down, and when you overkill an enemy, it leaves an exploding pumpkin behind, so I would recommend it. The demon powers I've explained. The consumables are a bit different, because the consumables are fairly limited. You don't necessarily get hundreds and hundreds of them, and there are lots of different kinds, and they didn't have a very long cooldown. Even the basic health potion has a fairly lengthy cooldown for a game like this, longer than you might expect if you're used to things like Diablo. A little more similar to things like Torchlight, actually, with the potion cooldowns. But there are also some potions that do all kinds of things. A Leech Bomb was one of my favorites. It does a big AoE bomb and then heals you depending on how much damage you did. There's Flash Bombs, Ambrosia, which is like a full heal, and I think an overdrive filling thing. There's even, oh, I think actually it's a cooldown filling thing, and then there's a separate overdrive potion. There's even this one that gives you, like, just a huge damage increase for a very short period of time. I think it's called, like, Bottled Madness or something like that. Kind of a neat name. And the other thing to note is the Divinity card system. And the Divinity cards are what you would think of in standard ARPGs as a sort of passive skill tree, the kind of things that you get from leveling up. That's basically what the cards are, because again, you have no classes, so there are no skill trees, no passives or anything in the standard sense. They come from the cards instead, which have a sort of tarot theme. There are lots of different kinds with different rarities. Pretty much everything in the game has a rarity system. It's a fairly simple rarity system. It is white for normal, green, then yellow, then purple. And purple is actually basically unique or legendary. And everything pretty much seems to have these rarities, although I haven't seen a purple consumable, though I assume they may exist. And if they don't, they should, because like a big awesome bomb or something would be pretty sweet. But the cards vary from fairly simple things like giving you extra armor penetration when you equip it, which is a useful one if you're not using a lot of weapons. It's useful with a scythe, I've noticed, because the scythe has very variable damage, unlike a lot of the others, which have a more, maybe less, but more reliable damage. The scythe varies greatly, so armor pen is nice on that. You can also give yourself more armor, because again, equipping separate pieces of armor for yourself isn't something that actually happens. You may notice that, I'm sure you've been noticing the big solar explosion thing that happens every now and then, which is also a card, the sun, which I like a lot. Every time you overkill an enemy, it releases a big solar explosion that kills more things usually. Very useful against big hordes. As a short cooldown, obviously, you can't just trigger it repeatedly, although that would be awesome. And there are even legendary cards as well. I actually got one that's basically focused on shotguns. One thing to note about the game is that the legendaries tend to not massively more powerful than everything else, but that have a very specific usage, which actually kind of reminds me of the legendaries in Path of Exile, but much simpler, because the legendaries in those games are basically build defining, as in they're not necessarily the absolute best things in the entire game, but the uniques are very much catered to specific builds, and if you happen to be building around that and get a unique for it, then it's like the best thing in the world. And this is like a simpler version of that, because obviously there are no class builds in the standard sense, but they're geared towards specific playstyles, as every weapon is. So I found one that's good for a shotgun, and I also happened to find a legendary shotgun, so the choice was obvious there. And you can even actually find modified ones, the Divine and Wicked cards. The Divine cards they have the same effects as normal cards, so any card can have that kind of modifier. So like the Alchemist is a card that reduces your consumable cooldown, because that's a big deal. So you could also, say, find a Divine Alchemist or a Wicked Alchemist, and every card can have that. Divine tends to be something that is some sort of positive, passive effect on the card, in addition to what it normally does. A common one I see for Divine is, I've seen several Divines that give you a chance to receive an extra item from a chest, for instance, which is kind of important, because this game doesn't give you nearly as much loot as you might expect from an ARPG. That's another thing that's different about it, because of course you don't have as many slots for loot. You don't get constant loot drops. You get enough of them, certainly, but you don't get, like, just dozens and dozens of them in every zone. So that's useful. You can also get the Wicked ones, which are more offensive, usually. Extra damage in certain respects, certain effects when you crit, for instance. Another common Wicked one I see is gives you speed when you crit, which is pretty useful, actually, because speed not only affects your movement speed, but also your attack speed, so you can power your way through huge hordes of enemies. And that's something that this game does have in a good amount. There are pretty large swathes of enemies to cut your way through, which is very satisfying. And that brings us on to the other different part of the game. You may be noticing it's kind of almost hub-based. You have a hub castle, and then you can go out to various large outdoor areas, which then have several dungeon areas within them. The large outdoor areas will have a kind of overarching theme, like this one I'm in right now is a harvest area, very much so, lots of pumpkins and kind of harvest-themed enemies. Even the uniques and mini-bosses are named, things like that. And, the pumpkins everywhere, jeez. But, basically, every wide open area, you could say, has, you know, a bunch of secrets to find, a bunch of objectives to do, and there are often lots of little optional boss encounters or like mini boss fights and things here and there that you can find that aren't technically considered secrets as far as the game goes. The secrets are actually chests you can find. But you'll notice that the story doesn't necessarily dictate that you explore every inch of these places. More often than not, you only have to go to 1 or 2 of the dungeons in them to move on in the story, technically. But the areas are actually pretty large, impressively so, actually, and because there's actually a jump function, like I mentioned, you can, you know, move around with the keys, which is a bit different for an action RPG. You can actually wall jump and get up to rooftops and things in some points, and that gives an interesting bit of depth, I suppose, in a literal sense, to the exploration of the game. Rooftops and the insides of buildings and things like that actually become important for secrets, and you'll often find little optional, unique boss encounters in these, which is really cool to me. They're just interestingly themed little mini-bosses that you didn't necessarily have to find, but you just kind of stumbled upon. And that's actually what this game does really well, in my opinion. In terms of, you know, the market at large right now, it's not as huge and, you know, excellent story and writing and things as something like Diablo. It's not as much of a massively complex and satisfying time sink as something like Path of Exile. But it still holds its own, in my opinion, because of the interestingly different nature of several of the mechanics around it. The fairly interesting narrator, who's really funny, actually, and you don't know who the hell he even is, but he constantly berates you for everything you do, and he's hilarious, and he also likes your hat a lot. Like, really likes your hat. But the fact that you can just explore these areas kind of your own volition and find unique bosses and secrets and things actually helps to, I wouldn't necessarily say pad out the game, because you are getting things for it. You're getting rewards and loot and levels. It's just something you don't have to do that aren't necessarily labeled as side quests. And every little dungeon area and big open area has this sort of 5-star system that'll have different challenges that you can do. The challenges basically are optional objectives, you could say. You don't necessarily have to do them, except for like obvious ones like beat the boss, which you probably have to do. But usually they're fairly difficult later on in the game. They get kind of challenging, often time-based, like get to the final boss and beat it in a certain period of time, things like that. There are also simpler things like finding all the secrets, or interesting ones like you must have these hexes active and kill these enemies. Hexes are sort of optional difficulty things, which is interesting. There are 5 of them. The hex, you can activate any of them that you want, any combination, all 5 if you're insane. And they give you extra experience and loot for having them active, but of course they make the game harder. I tend to run with the Hex of Time active, because I like the extra loot and stuff. And it's not too bad. Hex of Time makes enemies a little faster and they attack faster and things. You gotta be on your toes a little bit more, but it's not bad. There are other ones like, what's it called? There's one that makes a lot of enemies champion enemies, as in, you know, the ones with a lot of modifiers that are much harder. The Hex of Tyranny, I think? And there's the Hex of Pain, which gives you basically like life degen. You get hurt constantly, which sucks. And there's other ones too, more enemy damage, things like that. And a lot of these challenges revolve around different combinations of little optional objectives. There's even some where there are enemies that can hurt each other, these spiders that explode and kill each other, and a large kind of almost artillery spider that like launches big bomb things. It's kind of crazy. You can actually get them to kill each other, and that's one of the optional objectives in a couple of the dungeons, is to get them to kill enough of each other to get a star. And these stars reward you with different things, from extra loot chests to very valuable loot chests to gold and experience. Your levels are punctuated by, mostly, by large either health increases, extra divinity card slots, extra points, because as you noticed, I'm sure the divinity cards had numbers on them and they take a certain number of points to equip, and you can only have as many as you have the room and point value for. And occasionally extra mechanics early on, as in, you know, your divinity cards actually unlock the first time you level up, extra weapon slot, things like that. So it is not as deep and complex as a lot of the offerings on the market today, but it still holds its own. And people are reporting that it's fairly short. I would say that it's small. It's a more compact game. Short isn't necessarily the word. I'm sure you could blaze through the main storyline, but since the areas are so large and there's a bunch of extra dungeons that you don't technically have to go to, short is really referring to just kind of taking the straightest line possible through the main quests and not doing any of the other stuff, which you really should do for loot and levels because it's an action RPG, that's the point. And I think actually, personally, that the length is it helps it because it's kind of a bite-sized offering in the action RPG scene. So this is a good ARPG for people that don't necessarily like to play them oftentimes because they find them too repetitive or just too much of a time sink and they just can't dedicate it. Or even people that currently do have a time sink, like, say, Path of Exile, that takes hundreds of hours to develop your character, and you still want to play a game like that on your off time, but you don't want to have another game like, say, if you were playing Path of Exile and Diablo at the same time. That would be just like you wouldn't leave your house ever. But say you wanted to play a game like that, but you didn't want something that required such a heavy time investment of just dozens and dozens of hours. Victor Vran is that. It is a lighter experience that isn't dumb. It's not super simple. It's still quite satisfying, and it is a good action RPG with some very unique elements. It just doesn't take, you know, huge amounts of time and depth to get into it. Also, they are consistently updating it, and they're even promising some free DLC, including something like, let's see, the Tome of Souls DLC. They're unlocking a new playstyle, as they're saying. It's a kind of spellcaster ability-based weapon, by the sounds of it, which I'm looking forward to. I definitely want to see that. And, of course, there will be legendary ones. They mentioned the Necronomicon, which I'm hoping launches out Demon Cats. And 50 Shades of Slay. I have no idea what that one would be. I don't know if I want to know. Maybe it summons some kind of workplace sexual harassment lawyer. I don't know. And there are other DLCs on the way, as they are promising. I hope they see success with this. I really do. I hope that they are able to, you know, get out these free DLCs, maybe even a paid expansion at some point, who knows, and maybe even create a sequel or another game in this vein. Because I think it's actually pretty good. It holds its own in the action RPG scene, and it is in this interesting spot where it's a fairly bite-sized experience that isn't extremely short, but also doesn't require the time investment that a lot of other games in this genre are kind of known for, almost notorious for. So yeah, this is a good game for you if you're looking for something like this but don't want to invest hundreds of hours into something to build a character. Because you don't have to, but you can still get a satisfyingly lengthy and deep experience that is deep enough, I would say, for fans of the genre, and also not so crazy as for people that don't necessarily like the genre as much to get lost in. So there you go, Victor Vran. By the way, this is made by Heimamont, the people that make the Tropico games, which is a really weird departure from Banana Republic Island Simulator, Corrupt Governor 2.0 Simulator, to an action RPG. But hey, the Tropico games are good, and this is a good game too. So, Victor Vran, everyone. It comes at a fairly bite-sized price as well. It's $20, which compared to things like, say, getting Diablo 3 and the expansion, is not that expensive. So, I'd highly recommend it, actually. It's quite a bit of fun. It's got interesting enough mechanics to keep you going. The weapon and demon power skill system is pretty neat, and the divinity cards are a fun little tarot-themed kind of passive customization. The fact that you can change your entire build by just changing what you're equipped with at any given time is kind of neat, and it's a good ARPG for people that don't want to invest a huge amount of time. So thanks very much for watching, everyone. Victor Vran is out. Go check it out. In the description, I've put a link to the Steam page. $20. I believe it's actually a couple bucks off right now for the next day or so. And enjoy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.